Immerse yourself in a powerful, one of a kind musical journey like no other. From the company that brought you the award winning Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish and Harmony comes Amid Falling Walls, a tribute to the indomitable spirit during the Holocaust. Experience the resilience and hope portrayed through soul stirring Yiddish song. Witness this extraordinary testament to life, hope, and history for 4 weeks only, playing November 14th to December 10th at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Get tickets now at nytf.org. Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today we have a special guest. I am here with Maggie Anton, the writer of the acclaimed series Rashi's Daughters. And this is really a series, I think it came out about 15 or 16 years ago, and it really is one of the staples on any Jewish bookshelf. So, Maggie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I just realized actually it came out 18 years ago.
8 years ago. Oh my
Nice
goodness.
Jewish number.
Exactly. Well, happy Chai anniversary. That's
Of
incredible.
Rashi's Daughters, yes.
So let's start with Rashi. Our listeners may or may not be familiar with him. He, of course, was an 11th century French sage, probably most known for his extensive commentary both on the Torah and Tanakh and also the Talmud. But why Rashi? How did Rashi fall into your lap, and where did you get the idea to write about his three daughters?
Okay. In 1992, I heard about a woman's Talmud class being taught by Rachel Adler. That was so long ago that she wasn't a rabbi yet, and she didn't have her PhD yet. But if you've ever studied with her, you can imagine why she started a woman's Talmud class, because let's face it, there was Drisha in New York, but there wasn't any place in Los Angeles or Southern California or the western part of the United States where a woman could study Talmud. And so she started this class. We met around her dining table, and I somehow heard about it, and I signed up for it. And I admit I had some basic Jewish knowledge, but of course, I had never studied Talmud in any depth. And in those days, the only English translation was Sansino, which was kind of schwach.
Yes.
So I heard of it, I signed up for this class. Let's face it, all you have to do is forbid something, and it immediately becomes more attractive.
Mm.
And I had also heard that Rachel had, I knew she had this great reputation as a teacher. And sometimes if the teacher's great, you sign up for their class and you don't care what the class is. You just want to learn from them. So it was a shock to me when I got to her house and sitting around the table. Everyone except me was a woman rabbi, a rabbinic student. I was so out of my depth. And we're reading. We're using the what's his name? Let me look. Not Sansino, definitely.
Is it Steinsteltz?
Yeah, we're using Steinsaltz, the Hebrew version. And thankfully we spoke in English, so once we translated that, I could. And besides, if you study Talmud at all, you can spend like an hour on 3 sentences.
Yes.
So I didn't have problems with that. But being in a woman's Talmud, almost immediately you're introduced to Rashi. He's on every page, almost every line. And Rachel points out that Rashi had no sons, only daughters. Daughters reputed to be learned. And my kids were, leaving the nest. My husband's commute was getting longer and longer. I had a lot of free time on my hands. And the more, that we were studying here and, going into Rashi, I began wondering, what's with the daughters? Did he really have 3 daughters? Were they really learned? And so I decided in my spare time to look into this. Okay, living in Los Angeles, we got 3 rabbinic schools with their Judaic libraries. We've got UCLA, USC, Claremont colleges. They have all kinds of theological stuff there. And I started doing research. And the first place I looked was an ancient version of Encyclopedia Judaica which was in my synagogue's library. And the synagogue was formed in 1926, and that's probably when that version came out.
Got it.
And I'm looking at it. And what gave me the idea that I could do this kind of research was that during the time when Roots was a big sensation on television, a lot of people got into genealogy, and I did as well. And I learned a lot of techniques on how to do family histories. And I had never done anything back to the Middle Ages. Anyway, so I I opened up Encyclopedia Judaica, and of course, there's article on Rashi, and they had a nice little family tree that I looked at and immediately realized was wrong.
Hmm.
Because the number of daughters was correct and the number of grandsons was correct, but the order in which they came was clearly not correct. The person who wrote the article had, instead of Rabbeinu Tam being the last grandson, he had Rashi's grandson Shlomo being the last grandson born after Rashi died. Well, the mother of Shlomo was the oldest daughter, and Rashi died in he was born in 1040, died in 1106. We're actually coming up on Rashi's 1000th birthday. I may live so long. You probably will. Hopefully, I will too. And there better be a better.
It's going to be we're going to have to find a cake big enough for 1,000 candles there. It's going to be
right, yeah,
quite the job.
Right, or even 100 big fat ones. But yeah, that's coming up. Anyway, so I figured out, okay, if Yocheved was the oldest and she would have been born in like 1060 something, then she did no way she had a child after 1106, when Rashi died. I mean, I'm sorry. One of the things you learn in genealogy is that women don't have children in their 50s, especially in those days. And I did a little more research, and sure enough, Rabbeinu Tam was Rashi's youngest grandson. That was documented in a lot of places, and it was also documented that he was born in 1095.
Got it. And just sorry to pause you, just to paint our readers a little bit more of a picture for those who aren't familiar with sort of the great Ashkenazi rabbis. So we've introduced Rashi already, French rabbi, founded a yeshiva, known for really pulling all the best and brightest in the Ashkenazi world. So really, we're talking about France and Germany, maybe some scholars.
Yeah, and most of them are his relatives.
Yes, exactly. And then through his three daughters, really the entire Ashkenazi medieval world, was their offspring, especially the school of the Tosafists, of which Rabbeinu Tam, Rashi's grandson, was the most famous. So we're not just really talking about one person with Rashi. We're really talking about
whole
the
two yeshivas, because Rabbeinu Tam and his brother each formed their own. Anyway, so as soon as I realized, wait, that's wrong, and then I thought, okay, what else was wrong? What is the real? I didn't know what was the right thing, but I knew that was wrong. So that's what propelled me into doing more research about Rashi's family. Were there really only 3 daughters? No, there were 4 daughters. Only the 4th daughter was controversial, whether they had, not to argue over which children were whose. And so once I had gotten further into learning about Rashi's family, I was learning also about the Jewish community that his family was a part of, that he wasn't really the leader of, but he was the guy who ran the yeshiva, which was not what we would consider a yeshiva. It was like a bunch of 10-year-old kids from the neighborhood came to his house and learned. And I know all of this stuff because of Tshuvot Rashi and various, things that people wrote at the time. So I, actually have first, primary sources. I'll take a slight segue. Rashi wrote his commentaries during what's called the 12th century Renaissance. which nobody has heard of except the scholars of that time period. Everybody just thinks of the Renaissance, which is actually the 15th century Italian Renaissance. But during the 12th century Renaissance, it wasn't limited just to Italy. It was in the Christian world, the Muslim world, the Jewish world. And we think of it as like the Golden Age of Spain starts the 12th century Renaissance. And you have all these Muslim Jewish scholars who are dealing with each other in Spain. And then we don't even know who in the Christian world, who are only reading Latin, discover, oh, there's a lot of Greek stuff, by Ptolemy, by trying to think who's the one who writes about the soul. One of the Greek scholars.
Maybe.
Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
And meanwhile, in the Muslim lands, they're inventing algebra and astronomy and all that kind of stuff. And the Christians suddenly become aware that there is all of this scholarly material out there, some of which, like the treatise on the soul, they would really like to read, but they can't read those languages. And so they turn to the Jews, who of course can read and talk all of them. That's what they do. So they hired, or somehow insisted, that these Jewish scholars translate the Muslim texts, the Greek texts, and translate them into Latin. And then you start, once these get into Latin, then you have all the Christian scholars writing what they're writing, and new translations of the Torah. Oh, by the way, the King James version of, the English, that people kind of poo-poo, and other than, oh, it's so nice and poetic.
Yeah.
The guy who wrote that worked with Rashi on the translation. So it's the closest, certainly medieval or ancient Christian Bible that is the most accurate. And Rashi had a hand in that. His oldest son actually studied with Christians in Paris at their Heloise and Abelard. He studied with Abelard. And because it's like suddenly the Christians woke up and said, God did not give the Bible in Latin.
Yes.
We're not sure if the translation we have is what God really gave.
Yeah, well, the Middle Ages in the Ashkenazi world is fascinating because you have this sort of roller coaster, really, when it comes to Jewish-Christian relations. Obviously, just to paint the picture for the listeners, medieval Europe was under Christendom. Aside from Spain and Portugal, would eventually, the South would become part of the Christian world. But really, when we're talking 11th and 12th century, we're talking about France, and we're talking about England, and we're talking about Germany. And there were, of course, times of relative peace and ecumenicism and working between Jewish and Christian scholars.
Yeah.
Generally, historically, right, the medieval Ashkenazi period is actually not known for its, shall we say, interfaith relations. Generally, the story of medieval Ashkenazi Jewry is one of anti-Semitic persecution, which Rashi also, of course, dealt with, right? The last 10 years of his life were in the wake of the First Crusades. And one of the interesting things about Rashi, and then I do want to get to his daughters, who I think are the more interesting, of at least this conversation, but actually a lot of material from the Ashkenazi rabbinic tradition only survived because of Rashi's writings. And you had all of these different schools in Germany and in France, and all these biblical commentative traditions that had been really growing for 300-400 years. And they were all in one way or another destroyed. There were, we know there were several book burnings, both the Talmud and other rabbinic materials in Paris in the 1200s, and other places would follow suit. And so Rashi really saves us in a number of ways. He preserves this, medieval Ashkenazi tradition. He allows, the simple person, I'm including myself, of course, in the simple people, it allows us to actually read the Talmud without, breaking our neck over it. One other just interesting Rashi fact, and then we'll get to his daughters, is also for scholars of the French language, Rashi is also one of the only people who actually wrote in Old French, right? It was, of course, the spoken language in France in the medieval ages, but today, if you were getting a PhD in French literature or in the history of,
Oh, you'd be a great Talmud scholar,
yes,
ferreting out all those French words.
yeah, and I remember just jokingly, so of course, growing up in Jewish day school and yeshiva, we would study both Torah and Talmud, on the daily. And so Rashi was, I sort of always felt like I knew him growing up. But then every once in a while, Rashi would, interpret some word in the Torah that we were struggling over with some ancient French word, as if that helped. And so I remember, we would always look at each other and be like, well, that's even harder. But Rashi, of course, is a, probably the towering figure when you think of medieval Ashkenazis. So let's drop down to his daughters. And really, before going to his daughters, just the general question, there are, to the best of my knowledge, two scholars who focus on medieval Jewish women in the Ashkenazi world, Avraham Grossman and
Right.
Elisheva Baumgarten, who have both,
Right.
written extensively. They mostly agree. There's obviously some interesting debates there, but you have put together an extensive bibliography for.
There's over 400 sources
Yeah, I was
on
shocked
my
because this
on the
is
website.
usually I would think, and I've read, historical fiction is one of my favorite types of novels, and so I read a lot of it, and a lot of times I'm always curious, how accurately is this represented? So usually I figure the average novelist of historical fiction reads one or two books and then, paints a whole world based off of that. You read about 500 books and then tried to narrow it down. But what do we know about medieval women in the Ashkenazi world, and how do we know anything about them, given that I don't believe we have any written material from them?
We do have written materials because we have Chuvot Rashi, and we have in the 12th. One of the things that happened in 12th century Renaissance is people started writing things down, and not that all of it has been found, but there's a lot, and so that we know, and also from Rashi's commentary, because he throws in stuff about his family and because he's talking, especially, and the Tosafot throw in all kinds of stuff about their families.
Yeah, I admit that we don't have actually any sources written from women. It's sort of always filtered through, male rabbinic writings.
Right, maybe there's actually some indication that some of Rashi's responsa. Oh, no question about it, for sure. Some of Rashi's responsa was written by his daughters towards the end of his life, when he had what we could recognize as modern people. He had a stroke, so he could communicate with them, and they would write it down, is what it says. But of course, what really happened is that he was completely incapacitated, and his daughters had already been writing down his responsa to send it to people. They were like his secretary. And towards the end of his life, they're just answering the responsa. And scholars can tell the way it's written that it's not him. And even more so, his commentary on his Talmud commentary on Nedarim, I believe, is, strangely enough, it says attributed to Rashi. Whereas we have places in the Talmud where it's definitely written by a grandson, it's written by a son-in-law, and I'm looking at that, and me and my study partner, who's the Orthodox rabbi, there's no way that they didn't know who wrote this. This is a commentary, an entire tractate of Talmud. It wasn't anonymous. They know it's not Rashi, and they should have known who did it. And he was looking at it and saying, this actually sounds kind of feminine. And we came to the conclusion, but others have as well, that this was written by one or maybe several of Rashi's daughters. And of course, they couldn't attribute it to them, so it became anonymous.
Got it.
And the the style of the writing is, it's certainly not Rashi's, and it's not Rabbeinu Tam's, and it's not, anybody who we know wrote Rashi's
Yeah,
commentary.
I think traditionally in the Orthodox world, this is of course a non-academic statement, but it's attributed to the Rashbam, right, his other grandson, Shmuel. But yes, no, that is
Yeah.
an
So
interesting.
anyway, it's definitely. But anyway, so the Tosafot do talk about their mothers, and we have there's a volume that is not readily accessible, the Machzor Vitri, which is a compendium of laws and commentary and gossip compiled by Rashi's disciples. And actually, um, I had a copy of it. I later, it's in Hebrew and we translated it,
Oh wow.
so I don't need the original anymore. So, but that really talks about that. I mean, from there, I know that women had that in Rashi's community, women had aliyah to the Torah. I was too chicken to put that in the books. I didn't. I already got enough aggravation emails accusing me of making up stuff, accused me of getting the halakha wrong. Excuse me, Rashi did not put aluminum foil on his countertops during Pesach, and the most obvious kinds of halakha back then was very different. It was much more lenient. You had merchants who had to eat in any, inn that they came to, and if they were lucky, they could have fish. But there were certainly no kosher dishes.
Yeah.
Um,
No, it's always a fascinating point in terms of the development of halacha Jewish law, because just growing up as a student of the Talmud, you read, especially with kashrut, right, the laws of Jewish diet. You read these cases in the Talmud of these Babylonian rabbis that are asking, if you have an oven and there's a pork roast in there and a kosher meat, can you eat the meat? And half of them say, of course you can eat the meat. And today, we're dealing with stringency on a stringency on a stringency. Zooming back out a little bit. So we know that
anyway,
Rashi.
so we know from his responsa that he collected, or who knows who collected. As I said, we know women had aliyah to the Torah. And frankly, according to the Talmud, anybody can have aliyah to the Torah if they know Hebrew. And Hebrew was the language of merchants. Yes, mostly they were Jewish, but even the non-Jewish merchants had to know Hebrew for their accounts, because Hebrew decimal is a decimal system, and nobody wanted to use Roman numerals.
Mm,
So accounts, and also it was a way of keeping it secret, because you had to know this esoteric number system to do that. Anyway, so we knew that women blew the shofar because there was a responsive debate, about women blowing the shofar. We know that women wore tzitzit. Um, everybody, every Jew wore tzitzit, because there wasn't a talit was, the Aramaic is cloak, and that's all they wore, is cloaks. They weren't religious garments at that time. If you go back, and I can go back, there's plenty of illustrations in medieval manuscripts, and you see a room full of men in a synagogue praying, and only the leader at the front is wearing a talit. So that none of, they weren't. And actually, there's a response from Rashi in which somebody wanted to be buried with tzitzit, and Rashi says he never wore them during his lifetime. Why should he be buried with them? Anyway, so we know that all the Jews wore tzitzit on their cloaks, and they hung by the door. There weren't men's, there weren't women. So women did that. Women, as I said, they had haliyah to the Torah. They were counted in a minyan, partly because the men are merchants. They're long distance. They're gone. You wouldn't necessarily always even have 10 guys there, but that wasn't any of their argument. They just counted women in there. As I said, women blew the shofar. Um, Pretty much every one of the men's mitzvot, women certainly sat in the sukkahs. They did all the time-bound positive mitzvot. And
yeah.
we know that because they argue about it. And there were women, Mohelet, who, I mean, I had Miriam be a midwife and a Mohelet, but there were, because we have actually in Rashi's tshuva where some of the men are arguing that women should not be doing this, and it's pretty hard to argue against the Torah where Moses' wife circumcises their sons. I mean, I've seen Orthodox responsa where they try and get around that so that only men can do circumcisions, but women were doing them back then. And interestingly, they used the same like healing herbs and whatever that they might use in childbirth for circumcision. So anyway, so pretty much, I had not first person. I had primary sources. That's the thing about the 12th century. We start having stuff written down. So whereas in the 8th century, no, you don't know what anybody's doing because there's no written record of it. And the Talmud has not been written down as far as we haven't found much in terms of the Talmud until you get to the 12th century. And actually, Rashi very secretly wrote his commentary and taught teaching his daughters was no big deal. What he was really worried about was having the authorities find out that he was writing down the Talmud, which was supposed to be only oral. And you're absolutely right. If it wasn't for Rashi, we wouldn't have the Talmud anymore, because he's the one that was writing it down. And then after all the other yeshivot, I think there were 5 or 6 during Rashi's lifetime, and every one of them except his disappeared not because they were destroyed from anti-Semitism. The yeshivot in Morocco and in Spain were caught in the crossfires of the Christian-Muslim wars, or the Muslim wars, the Berbers versus whoever the other ones were.
Yeah.
And in a very sad situation for the 2 yeshivot that were left in Bavel and in Israel were supported by the outside communities. And there was, I don't know what year it was, but it's not hard to find, there was an argument over the calendar.
Yes.
Just like there had been between Israel and Babylonia since whatever. But anyway, there was an argument over the calendar, and they couldn't, they ended up not agreeing on what it was. And they were a month apart for Yom Kippur. And the diaspora is going, these guys cannot decide what day Yom Kippur is. I'm not sending any money to their yeshiva anymore. We got calendars here. We can see a new moon, and we'll figure it out ourselves.
Yeah, all it takes is really opening up a history book to realize that this is not the first time in Jewish history that the Israel community and the diaspora have fights over all sorts of ideological issues. I believe the calendar dispute was earlier. That might be the 10th.
Oh yeah, no, that calendar year, but they still disputed, even though they theoretically already knew when it was. And it's a sorry commentary on Judaism that it destroyed, those yeshivas disappeared. And Rashi's little yeshiva in Twa, and then later his Rabbeinu Tam had his own in Ramaru. Those were what kept Talmud available and alive, for later. And then and when the yeshiva's gone, nobody could study it right, and so you started having all these guys writing codes. Maimonides was actually excommunicated for for writing Mishnah Torah. But anyway, so I knew from all the responsa, and I must admit, I already had finished writing Rashi's Daughters when Baumgarten and anyway, the other one who wrote both of those books came out very close together about Jewish women in medieval times, and it was very close to when I had, Rashi's Daughters came out. So part of me was really, those came out as like, oh my God, I'm going to find out that everything I did, my research was wrong, and I didn't know what I was doing. But it turns out we used the same sources, and so I gave a big sigh of relief.
Yeah, it's incredible. Just a couple things to flag there for listeners. I mean, a lot of, so there were these infamous book burnings that happened all throughout the Ashkenazi world, usually by Christian authorities, and especially the Talmud was singled out for a unique ire because, there were all sorts of debates that actually the Christian authorities would make Jews engage in to try to disprove, a whole host of things. Probably the most famous one is Nachmanides in Spain, in Barcelona, the disputation. But when these debates would end, there would be these mass book burnings. Today in 2023, obviously book burnings are still bad, but we have backups of things, right? So if somebody burns 1,000 copies of the Talmud today, it's still a tragedy in some sense, but we can go to the printer and print out 100 more, or open our phone and open up Sefaria. When the Talmud was burned in the medieval Ashkenazi community, that really was the end of access to all of this information, possibly for all of the Jews of Ashkenaz. And so these are, much bigger deals than just the symbolism of a book burning. It really was the decimation of a whole host of information. And I wanted to
this is way after Rashi's time.
Yes.
Because there's no books to burn until you have the printing press. And interestingly, the very first book, Hebrew book, printed in a printing press in like 1500. I mean, hot off the presses. There were hardly any presses there. And this one was in Venice, was not only, of course, it's going to be the Torah, but it was the Torah with Rashi's commentary. And that's where Rashi script came from. Rashi didn't write Rashi script. He wouldn't know what it was if he saw it. But the printer had to come up with a different, what we would call font, in printing the Torah to separate what was actually the Torah, and that was the block letters that block Hebrew we're familiar with. And then when it came time to put Rashi in there, he had to create a new font, and being thrifty fellow, he used the font that used the least ink. Ink was really, as you read my book, ink is really expensive in those days, how they made it. And so he used the font that was the most economical. And now we're stuck with Rashi script, not only for Rashi, but all kinds of Jewish sources use it for the side notes or
for listeners who are not aware of what Rashi script is, Rashi is printed in a script that is close-ish to, but not exactly the same as Hebrew. So about half the letters are different. So one of the things that, typically in early yeshiva days, I think I was, 7 or 8 when I learned it, you basically have to learn Hebrew, and then you have to learn a second language that is Hebrew, but with completely different letters. And it is, much to the chagrin of the young both Chumash Torah scholar and also Talmudic scholar.
It's like handwriting or shorthand, or not shorthand because all the letters are in there.
It's like trying to read like handwriting. You're trying to read ancient doctor's notes. You're like, what is he saying?
Right.
So just to fill in a little bit of the history, and then we'll go backwards, and narrow in on Rashi's daughters. For the listeners hearing you talk about the 11th and 12th century as times of more gender egalitarianism, even though probably nobody in the 12th century would say it like that. And they're wondering what happened
definitely not
in the late 12th and 13th century as a result of increased persecution in the Ashkenazi world. Different pietist movements arose in the Ashkenazi community that stressed a whole host of, extreme pietistic and ascetic
purity and impurity
and purity and impurity.
And we know who's the impure ones.
Exactly. And that really, and at least for the Ashkenazi world, that really, I think, set back a lot of the gender
absolutely
egalitarianism because of a lot of these pietist movements that were historically brought upon by, Christendom anti-Semitism. So just to paint a picture for the listeners of how complicated the medieval world was. So just going back to the Rashi's Daughter series. So you wrote a fantastic historical novel / fictional work of Rashi's 3 daughters, and they're really growing up, both scholars and also trying to navigate the world in terms of both dating and marriage and finding a job and everything like that. For the parts that didn't come out in research, so for the more creative aspects, how did you?
The sex scenes.
There's also a bunch of sex scenes, which I'm sure got you some fun some fun fan mail from people that
Well,
don't.
and also some scathing
Yes.
objections from um, Orthodox women who, not having read anything by me before, assumed that this was more a pious history um,
Yes. They
than what
thought
I wrote. But
exactly. They thought they were going to
I
get the.
wrote the book that I wanted to read, and that's why it's like it is. Although I did chicken out, I did not put anything. I did not show women have a aliyah in the Torah in in the book, and so I left out some of the more, I won't say egregious, but what the ones that I knew would bring down the wrath.
Hmm.
And I got enough, not hate mail, but just complaints that I got the halakha wrong. How dare I insult or impugn the holy, Rashi and his family? And after a while, I had like a stock email
Yeah.
on that. And what I also got a lot of, which certainly has to do with Rashi's daughters, is the amazingly large number of people who think they are descendants of Rashi, who didn't realize he had no sons. You're not descended that way, folks. But the what women were doing at that time was not just in the Jewish world. The Christian world also. You start having, like Heloise and Abelard, you start having great Christian women scholars. They're all in convents where the women had nothing, frankly, literally nothing better to do than studying the great Christian texts, which they did. And you also, in the political world, women in the Christian world could be rulers under their own names. So you have, um, anyway, you have various women who ran their countries or their what we call counties. They're the countess or the duchess. The men were often fighting who knows who, usually each other. And that's actually how the first crusade, not that they called it the crusade, and they certainly didn't know at first that there were going to be other ones. The Pope came up with this idea that uh, he would call for a pilgrimage of armed guys to go and rescue Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the infidels. And this would keep them from fighting each other, and there would be more peace in France. And he, big mistake, told them, if you go to the Holy Land and do this pilgrimage, you will go to heaven. Every sin that you ever committed will be forgiven. So you not only had these the knights do it, but every kind of miscreant who had a lot of sins on his shoulders decided to go too. And that's who does most of, at least the first, does all the horrible damage to the Jewish communities, because they know, these guys are rich. I'll as long as we're going nearby, I might as well stop in there. And of course, most of them never made it to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
They got wiped out when they hit Constantinople. But so you had women leadership as queens, as countesses, and people were used to having, you're run by the queen. She's the one that makes the decisions. And you also had Christian women scholars in the convents, and everybody is used to learned women in their society. So there wasn't the misogyny. Well, anyway, there were women in positions of power and knowledge that made it easier to have women in the Jewish community like that. Um, and that, I don't know, that changed later, because they also, the Christian world stopped letting the oldest daughter, if there was no son, they would let the daughter become the queen, or the daughter become the countess or the duchess and rule. They didn't, and that, honestly, I like to tell people, I'm the world's expert on medieval Jewish Ashkenaz, medieval Jewish women or medieval Jewish society between 1000 and 1200. Don't ask me about 1205. I mean, I literally did not look at any of that. There's not much to look before 1000.
Yeah. Well, also what happened, at least to the best of my knowledge of the medieval Jewish world, is because in the 1100s and 1200s, there was so much, entire cities of Jewish communities in the Ashkenazi world were wiped out. Most of the Jewish legal texts that survived were from the Sephardic world, which was down both in Spain and North Africa. And for all sorts of probably sociological and cultural reasons, right? When you read Maimonides' legal codes, who was, of course, right after Rashi, his view of female participation, shall we say, is a little bit more,
Well, the Muslim world, that was how it was. And in the Christian world, it had, there were more places for women than in the Muslim world. So, that's that. But what really got, apparently really, really was bad for women, thank you very much, Shulchan Aruch, is that the superstitions and the fear that that men had of women menstruating. I mean, some of the responsa in there is like, curl your hair. I mean, this stuff does not get reprinted. Nobody wants to talk about that anyway, and certainly not at that time. But they believed that the breath of a nida's breath will contaminate you. That you can't walk, that you don't walk in her footsteps. And we're talking dirt roads, so there's certainly footsteps. And you got to walk. That's why women are supposed to walk behind the men, so that they can't. There's no footsteps for the men to step in and get tameh, impure. Rashi vigorously fights this. He, this quote that I found. Who knows where I found it in his works? That he's really ticked off at all these pietists who are trying to exclude women from everything on account of nidah, and he says nidah only affects a man and his wife. The Torah says you don't sleep with one, but all the other business about nidah doesn't affect us today. We are all tameh hamet, which is a much worse impurity, the impurity of death. And there's no way you can get rid of it. We haven't had a red calf for who knows how long. And as soon as, I try to explain to people, it's like cooties. If you have cooties and you touch someone, then they have cooties, and then they touch someone. So there were no Jewish mortuaries that prepared the dead. Everybody, every family prepared their own relatives who died, pretty much. So of course you would get impure by death actually just touching a real corpse, but it wouldn't matter because somebody that you touched, that they touched, it was impure. And Rashi says that we are all tameh hamet. It doesn't matter in the synagogue. If the woman is accustomed to making tzitzit, to working on the cloaks and making the tzitzit, she does it when she's nidah. It doesn't matter. If she's accustomed to repairing like the robes and everything go over the Torah scroll or the ark, the curtains, if she does those kind of things, because most of the seamstresses were women, it doesn't matter if she's nidah. She can do it. It doesn't affect anything. And if she wants to go to synagogue, she goes to synagogue. If she's accustomed to going to synagogue, she goes to synagogue. If she's accustomed to holding holy objects or whatever, she does that. If she's accustomed to studying Torah, she does that. And this is a guy clearly does, that has daughters. But he was really vehemently against restrictions on women because they might or might not be nida. And apparently, in his community, it was effective. But the Shulchan Aruch, out of nowhere, there says women who are nida are forbidden to go to the synagogue.
Yeah, so just to explain a little bit, so the Shulchan Aruch, of course, wasn't written until the 16th century, but it was written by Joseph Cairo. Just for listeners that are, hearing this word and don't know what it means, the Shulchan Aruch was a compilation of all of really Sephardic Jewish law, and it was written at a time after the Spanish expulsion of the Jews in 1492. A lot of the Sephardic Jewish community, especially the leadership, moved to the north of Israel to the beautiful town of Tzfat, where then, both Kabbalah and also Jewish law was developed in fascinating ways there, probably for another podcast. But the book that is referring to is the Shulchan Aruch, which was written by Joseph Cairo, the leader of the community, where seemingly out of nowhere, he takes a much stricter turn.
Yes. Well, all the codes that got written after the yeshivot disappeared and nobody could actually study Talmud anymore, there was a bunch of codes. And I think, as I said, Maimonides was excommunicated for writing his, because they had to get this down to like one volume, even if it was a fat one. So wherever the Talmud has a difference of opinion, where the argument ends, teku, this one and this one are both, the lenient, here's the strict, you do what you can do. Both of these are the words of God, and you follow which one you like. When they did the codes, they used only the strict ones. You ended up with and because they were printed, they were distributed every place. And the Shulchan Aruch is still authoritative for Orthodox Jews today. I don't think they study the part about women in Nida not going into synagogues, but it's that disadvantaged women greatly is when you have arguments about women doing time-bound positive mitzvot in the Talmud. There's I can't remember the two rabbis. One of them is I think Rav Judah, and the other, who's always arguing with him, is his usual argument. So the two of them argue about all of this, and they're never resolved. It's like, if you're a follower of Rav Judah, then women get to do all this stuff, and if you're the follower of the other Rav, then they don't. But of course, when they put it into the code, they cut out the lenient opinions. And there's one place where I found specifically a mistranslation, which I'm sure is deliberate, in the let's see. In Tractate Rosh Hashanah, page 33a, they're talking about women blowing the shofar. Is this permitted? And the Mishnah starts out that children who are normally not required to do any mitzvot, they can blow the shofar because they need to learn how. And immediately after the Mishnah, there's the two words, Nashim Asur. Okay, there's no punctuation.
Which in Hebrew means woman, and then forbidden, just for
listeners. Women forbidden. And the translations, once you put in punctuation, have this as a sentence, where it's very obvious from what comes next that it's a question, because it says women and children may do this if they're qualified. I mean, women reading Torah, you have to be able to read Hebrew and not be embarrassed to speak in public. But every single English translation that I've seen of the Talmud has women are forbidden to blow the shofar. But then, instead of with a question mark, are women forbidden? Which there's no you can't, there's the point, you don't have the punctuation and you don't have the verbs. You don't have a, verb for is or was. So all you can say is women, asur shofar.
Yeah.
When that clearly isn't, uh, they're saying, oh, you can blow it if you want. And nowadays women do.
Interesting. Yeah, no, just to zoom out a little bit, this is something that I
Which
find.
is why I stuck Rashi's daughters blowing the shofar.
Hmm.
I mean, they really did raise sheep. They,
Yeah.
um, I went. My daughter did her junior year abroad in France, and I took her to France with me to look at all the Rashi places, and she did, and we've in Ramaru where Rabbeinu Tom lived, and where he had his yeshiva. It's there. I mean, actually, there's stuff in Troyes also that's there, but you could actually see, like, I don't know when exactly a bunch of Jews bought the land and the buildings on it to come out, to keep it for history. So you could go there, you can see where they actually lived. Theirs was the yeshiva. Um, and I encourage people to do that. The city of Troyes is very proud of its medieval scholars, Christian and Jewish. There's a Rashi walking paths that takes you. It still looks like medieval times. They have a not zoning, but how you build your house. It has to look on the outside like it's the 12th century. So the streets are cobblestone in the old city. They still have the walls. Inside, modern plumbing, everything. Outside, you're walking around and it's the 12th century.
Yeah. So for listeners who are interested, this debate, this wider Jewish debate between legal codes versus non-legal codes is probably one of my favorite. I spend actually almost an entire class session in the Intro to Jewish Text class at UC Irvine that I teach about this, because of course, huge debate about, right, the Talmud preserves 2 to 3 opinions on everything. And if you reduce the discussions of the Talmud to binary Jewish law, right, you lose a lot of the back and forth and multiplicity. And so, the Tosophists, who we've kept alluding to, they were a school of thought really made up of most of Rashi's sons and grandsons that really attempted to dissect and understand the Talmud. They were also pretty against the legal codification of Jewish law, whereas down south in Spain, you had Maimonides, which of course, started a wider trend of actually trying to codify law. Without going too much on a tangent, I want to bring us back. I know that our time is coming short here. What else have we not discussed? What other topics about Rashi's daughters, the book, the research, any other book projects you might be working on or have written? What else would you like to let our listeners know?
Oh, I am writing another book, but that's all I'm going to say about it. I'm not going to, tempt the evil eye.
Amazing.
And if you want to know a lot more about the evil eye and I don't call it superstition. I call, it's sorcery, or sometimes it's just healing spells that the women were doing, and women were doing it in Talmudic times, which we know from the Talmud, and we also know because we have artifacts, amulets, and incantation bowls, which have survived from that time period, and they're written in Hebrew, and they quote Mishnah, they quote Torah a lot, and they're trying to, what do they know about healing? They have to get rid of the demons that have caused it, or the evil eye, or curses. And when I talk about the Rav Hizda's book series, um, my audiences, who are predominantly Jewish women and certainly always Jews, I don't have to tell them what a demon, the evil eye, or a curse is. They all know that.
Hmm.
And they didn't know, and it was Jewish women that were, in the Torah it says, you shall not let a sorceress. The Hebrew is very convoluted, what exactly, but anyway, you shouldn't let a sorceress live, and that's, I think, in Mishpatim. And then there's another one that we read twice it talks about sorcery always in the feminine.
Mhm.
And the rabbis ask, why are the sorceresses always, why do they say sorceresses? Why do they? And they admit, because sorcery is the province of women. But in the Talmud, you have plenty of rabbis who are casting spells, who are writing amulets. They tell you how to write a legal one that you could wear on Shabbat, because the amulets are bracelets or around your neck to keep you protected all the time. Although apparently the most popular amulet was one to win at chariot races. They found them in the where they've excavated the stadiums in, and so women have always had this province of healing and how to keep the demons away or curse somebody. Both of them was something that women did, and even through now, my daughter-in-law is from, her family came from Iraq. They lived in Baghdad, and I talked to her grandmother, who was still alive back then, and her grandmother said, "Yeah, and things." And we're talking 20th century. They were still doing that, and we know about all these because they've dug up like 10,000s at least of these bowls and amulets. The amulets written in paper, of course, or leather, didn't survive, but there were metal ones. But the bowls, anyway. So the names of angels, Jewish angels are on these bowls. The women who wrote them were clearly learned, and that is Rav Hizda's daughter. I make her one of these sorceresses. Although the first one is apprentice, she's got to learn how to do it. And then the second one, for people who want to know about Jewish women, about what Jewish women's lives were like in the community of rabbis that wrote the Talmud. That's the community, because I was, of course, very curious. Like, okay, you obviously have women there, and I chose Rav Hizda's daughter. Partly, she's the daughter of one of the prime scholars of that time period. But there's a little scene in the Talmud where she's maybe 9 or 10 years old, and there weren't yeshivas back then. The rabbis taught in their living room, just like Rashi did, and the students would come to learn Jewish law. And in Talmudic times, they learned Jewish law because the Jewish community had its own laws. They had the Exilarch, they had their own king. Cyrus the Great was the great for a good reason. He conquered the people, and he said, "Okay, you pay taxes to me. My army will protect you, but you do your own thing. I'm not going to interfere in you running your own community." So we have a Jewish king through this time. Anyway, so she's in the classroom or the living room, and Rav Hizda calls her up in front of the class and asks her, and he calls up his two best students, Rava and Rami Bar Hama. For the people who are listening to this, Rava is the Moses of the Talmud. He's mentioned over 4,000 times. His decisions are still halacha now in many cases. Anyway, he calls up Rava and he calls up Rami Bar Hama, and you can see by the arguments in the Talmud that they hate each other when they're having disagreements. Anyway, he asks his daughter, "Who do you want to marry?" In front of the whole class. The two guys are standing there. And she says, "Both of them." And then the Talmud tells us that's exactly what happened. First, she married the older one, and then she was widowed, and then she married Rava. And I thought, okay, I can't pass up that. A woman with two husbands, one of whom is the greatest Talmudic scholar of ever. And I also realized I've been studying Talmud for how many decades, and I know nothing about the women in that community.
Yeah.
And surely in the Talmud, I can find that. You know what I mean? There's a whole tract of Talmud called Kalim about vessels. There it is. There's your kitchen. And how they did everything with it. I didn't need that's So anyway, that's the series that came after uh, Rashi's Daughters. Unfortunately, I didn't, the editor that I had at Penguin for the Rashi's Daughters left, and I got a new editor. I mean, they assigned me a new editor who really wasn't very enthusiastic about Rob Hisda, but I had already signed a contract for it before my earlier editor left. So they didn't support it much, and you'll rarely find it in a bookstore even these days, which annoys me greatly. But that's life in the book world.
Yes. Well, just to wrap up, I just wanted to thank you
yes.
so much for coming on to the podcast. And readers should definitely look at both the Rashi's Daughters and Rechiz's Daughters book series. Maggie Anton, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. And my cat never came in
Immerse yourself in a powerful, one-of-a-kind musical journey like no other. From the company that brought you the award-winning Fiddler on the Roof in Yiddish and Harmony comes Amid Falling Walls, a tribute to the indomitable spirit during the Holocaust. Experience the resilience and hope portrayed through soul-stirring Yiddish song. Witness this extraordinary testament to life, hope, and history for 4 weeks only, playing November 14th to December 10th at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Get tickets now at nytf.org.